Welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's great to be with you here today to bring you more content to help you think more deeply and richly as a Christian from the Bible and Christian tradition. Today on the show, I've got a great guest lined up for us. We've got on the show Chris Bolt, who is the Director of Theology and something else. You just have kind of an all-encompassing job out there at the Village Church. I know it's Richmond, not Flower Mound. Chris, what is your job out there?
Director of Theology and Apologetics. So the theology
Theology.
is mostly inward-facing, apologetics will be outward-facing.
Excellent. And you just started there a few months ago, is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Well, I hope you're settling in well. I know you're from that area. And so you've been on quite the journey to get to where you are now. Part of that journey involved a PhD. I opened up your dissertation last night. It's actually very easy to find on Google. And so I opened up your PhD because I know you had written on what we're going to talk about a little bit today, presuppositionalism, Van Til, these kind of things, stuff that I'm actually very interested in. But you got that PhD in 2016. Can you tell me more about why you got it and what inspired you to go get a PhD?
Yeah. When I went back to college for the second time, I had to redo a lot of courses at a community college, and then I transferred over to a historically Disciples of Christ school, which is essentially liberal and non-Christian other than those associations. And I studied philosophy and religion. I double majored in those. I wanted to learn those from an unbelieving perspective in particular. And at the same time, I was coming across Greg Bahnsen and started to read Cornelius Van Til and learned about essentially how to use skepticism against the skeptics and subjectivism against the subjectivists. And everything that I read, it seemed good in broad brush strokes, but there were some problems as far as the particulars. So there was a lot in the literature about, well, there's a lot of work to be done here. And one of those areas of work that could be done was regarding David Hume, the Scottish skeptic, David Hume's problem of induction, which pertains to the laws of nature, epistemology, metaphysics, and all of it. So that's what I focused on actually in undergraduate studies. And then, of course, I went to Southern Seminary for a few years for my MDiv and went ahead and overlapped it with the PhD. And I continued to write on David Hume's problem of induction, but broadened that into some other programs that have been done with regard to that topic in relation to a Van Tilian presuppositionalism.
Okay, fascinating. We're going to dive into a lot of that. So I'm really excited to have you on the show because a lot of times I interview a lot of guests like yourself who are experts in people I don't know about. So Hume is somebody I've heard a lot about, have not read Hume myself, but he comes up in literature often. And so I'm excited to have you on the show for that discussion. I've got to ask though, when most people go get a PhD, people ask me this as I'm in a PhD program. They're like, "Well, is the goal to become a professor?"
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, not necessarily. That that was actually one of the bottom rung things for me. One of my advisors had to be like, "Well, what doors do you want to open with a PhD?" And I was like, I don't know. I just want to do research and learn more. And they're like, "Well, you should probably consider that. That's part of the typically part of the thing that people want to do." So I have to ask you, what was like the hope with getting a PhD? Did you want to become a professor? What track were you on there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a churchman and I think I'll always be a churchman. I've always had a leg in either world, though. I mean, when I went back into the academy, because my mentors were saying, hey, you may sense a call to the pastorate, but you're going to have to get some education. That made me fall in love with education. And that's kind of where that came from. The PhD actually served, in my case, to sharpen what I learned in the MDiv, because I didn't go to Bible college or something like that. And so I had not studied some of the things that a lot of those guys had studied already going into the MDiv. So the PhD actually sharpened those specifically Christian disciplines for me. But it also, I mean, it did open some doors. It's the calling card of the academy, as it were. I believe very strongly in the pastor theologian model. That's something that we need to bring back. And actually, all of that pertains to my position here now as well, because I have one foot in each world, as I work toward just our core discipleship, the different topics and disciplines that people in the church need to know on a little bit deeper level. And I think that actually and this could have been a whole podcast episode. I think you did one on it actually. This is where we need to go in terms of seminary training in particular, because um, the I'm going to call them big box seminaries.
Yeah.
They're really serving kind of professionals, and it's not what seminary was initially when a vision for seminary began. Um, it's not the same thing anymore. It's just a professional degree sort of thing. So there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I don't think it's wrong for people to want to seek more theological training. I think that's great. It's just not what a seminary is in terms of training up pastors.
Right. Yeah, agreed. And that's the same thing that happened to me with my MDiv. I got there and there were all these guys from like Baylor, other places, and they were like breezing through these classes on Greek or Hebrew or whatever. And I was like, dude, I've never done any of this. I did an engineering degree, basically a business engineering degree. And so I get there and so yeah, the going to a THM and then an MDiv really helps you dive deeper into the literature. So I guess back then, 2016, you complete the dissertation. Were you on track to go be a professor somewhere, or were you on track to go be a pastor somewhere?
I was more so on track to go be a pastor. The interesting thing is, as soon as I became a pastor, and I was an associate pastor, but a pastor nonetheless, and we believed in plurality of elders. Um, Immediately, I gave a lecture at a fellowship. And one of the men there heard it. It was called a hodgepodge of presuppositionalism or something like that. And he worked to hire me on at the first place that I taught. So I've essentially been teaching for as long as I've been pastoring, and that was just sort of accidental. And again, that's kind of grown through the years. I've gotten different opportunities, mostly things on the side and whatnot. And now in this new position, that's going to flip. I won't be doing the hospital visitation and the funerals and things like that as much. Rather, my main focus will be on the academic side, but within the church.
That's excellent. That's great. And yeah, I resonate with that deeply. And actually, it's nice to be part of a church that values that, like where they don't view the PhD with suspicion. There's reasonable suspicions they should have, but they typically cherish the research and the different perspective that you typically bring either to the pulpit or to the classroom. Where most of my classes I teach like seminar style at the church. I want people involved, a lot of Socratic method. And people, especially in a town like Boulder, and Richmond has some universities in it as well. A college educated populace tends to appreciate that kind of stuff. So that's great that you're in a place like that. Um, with your kind of journey over the last 7 years, I didn't get to know you until these last 2 years. But you've been off and on Twitter. I know you weren't on for a while. Now you're back on, and it seems that some people are disappointed with your the new iteration of Chris Bolt. Um, I don't know what that's about. Can you talk me through that? Both like why you deactivated and now you've come back, and it seems a lot of people are caught off guard by maybe a different posture or something. Like what's going on there?
Well, part of the reason or part of the problem is that I don't know what that is about, right? So Twitter is, and I'm going to quote James Lindsay, even though I really, really don't want to. James Lindsay calls Twitter something like a deconstruction machine.
Okay.
And it is. I mean, we have to realize when we look at Twitter, we're not all seeing the same thing. And it's actually tailored to what we've already seen and what it thinks we want to see. It is intersubjectivity on steroids. And I mean, anyone who has over, say, I don't know, 800 follows probably has experienced the sorts of things that Twitter can do, right? So you'll put something that you've put a lot of thought into, you'll throw it out there on Twitter, gets no interaction whatsoever. But you're cooking dinner and you just think of something funny and throw it out there and it gets a million impressions,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. There's no telling what will ever happen there. I think what I would say in relation to posture I think posture is probably a fair place to press that question. I think perhaps my posture, if you want to say that, has changed a little bit. So let me go back. Let's go back. Yeah, I think you said 7 years, so back to 2016. Um, so I don't think that anything in terms of my core convictions or theology or philosophy or any of that has changed. To my knowledge, I'm trying to think of if I've changed any of my doctrinal beliefs since then, and I don't believe that any of them have changed. Um, I am much more skeptical about associational life and cooperative bodies, and not only what the purpose of those is, but how you set the parameters, um, and why. And that's not, even taking a shot at someone, because I'm talking about, if you're talking about a 10 church cooperative body that's staunchly, say, 1689 or something, it's the case there. Or if you're talking about the SBC, which is massive, I don't always understand what exactly the purpose of that is supposed to be, or how we set those parameters and determine, oh, it's going to be these sets of parameters and not these sets of parameters. And so I'm a little bit of a punk when I press those lines and press some of those issues. Um, let's see what else. Posture wise, yeah, I mean, a lot has changed. I think everybody can say that a lot has changed, especially through the COVID pandemic, through all of the Trump stuff, which is unfortunate because I pretty well don't think about Trump on a daily basis, but I'm
Sure.
confident that a lot of people do.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's what people think about all the time and can't turn it off.
Yeah.
I think that's unhealthy. But there's been a lot of revelation of hearts through all of that, and some positions that may have been under the surface in a lot of individuals in the past have come to the fore now, and their hearts have been revealed. And so at that point, I mean, the lines become much clearer. And I would say that I was probably slow to see some of the, I'm going to say, the theological liberal drift that we're seeing. That's repackaged. It does not look the same that it did, say, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, but it is a reiteration of that. And I've done some other podcasts on this. I believe it's a reiteration of that in terms of the so-called soft sciences versus the hard sciences, as back then. Um, so yeah, I don't know if you want me to unpack that anymore or what. As far as quitting Twitter, I kind of despise Twitter. Right? It's like a love-hate relationship. It is interesting because you can put something out there and be heard, and that's a healthy thing, and that can also be a very unhealthy thing, right? But the way that I use Twitter is not because I'm ashamed of anything that I've said in the past, or I'm afraid of anyone or anything like that. That's just simply not the case. If I'm wrong and you can convince me that I'm wrong, I'll I'll repent, or I'll say,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm wrong, and I
Right.
put it out there. I'm not worried about that. So yeah.
That's funny. How long were you off Twitter before you came back on?
Yeah, I was off. I mean, I came back in whenever Anaheim was, for the SBC. Was that 21? Because a lot of guys were pressing me to endorse Tom Askell, which I did.
Okay.
So I came on to do that. But outside of that, I think I was off maybe 2.5 years.
Nice. I'm
Yeah,
sure maybe your
it was
mental health
nice.
was better then.
Absolutely, it was nice.
That's funny. Yeah, I joked in my head when because you got back on, then you got back off, and it was like snip, snap from The Office. Where it was like, "What's Chris doing, man?
Yeah. Or
He's
there's
crazy."
the whole thing, like anybody who's ever done any youth ministry or whatever, there's always that kid who comes and he's there for like a month and he leaves and he comes
Yep.
back 3 months later. Everybody's like,
Yep.
oh, and he gets this big welcome, right? I
Yeah.
promise I'm not actually trying to do that.
You're
But
just so cool. You're the
I,
cool
I
kid.
just, I honestly just didn't. I thought it was mostly a waste of time. So
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think with the thing about online social networking, all that kind of stuff, part of the reason I got back on was all of a sudden I could see what people actually believed about matters, right?
mhm.
Because in their publications, they're gonna like try to like be either neutral or try to like appeal. And then on Twitter, you're seeing that. But not only that, I could see like what people at my church were seeing and liking and following. And I was
Yeah.
like, oh no, this is bad. This is real bad. And so it's a helpful tool for that. But I think you're totally right on the um, kind of the intersectionality there and the self-reinforcing beliefs, and it can really get you down a rabbit hole of some crazy stuff. But I think there's a way to use it prudently, and so I appreciate your wisdom on that. Kind of going back to your PhD on Van Til, just a little bit about me. I went to Denver Seminary, got into John Frame, got into presuppositional apologetics a little bit, but the approach at Denver Seminary for apologetics was Doug Grotius's cumulative case approach.
Mhm.
And so I was kind of steeped in that. It was massively helpful for me. He introduced me to Nancy Pearcey. We read a lot of her work and Schaeffer. And so I found that. And then eventually I got to Frame, and that's about where I capped out. And that's why I did my THM and my book on Frame. And then all of a sudden I talked to Frame, and he's like, "You're a Van Tillian." And I'm like, "Cool, man." Like, I don't know exactly what I'm in, but right now what's been happening over the last few years as I'm studying historical theology is I'm naturally bumping up against all these people who are more natural theology guys. And I think precepts get a bad rap in those circles for some reason. But just a quick example: we did a college event, an outreach event on campus, and one of our guys at our church is presuppositional, and he was fantastic, man. He was just great because you get a precept apologetic guy out there, and he is kind of rabid, almost like energetic, ready to engage, ready to go after people, and not in an unloving way either, but just a really good engagement with the college students. And I loved it. And he was like, "Chase, aren't you precept?" And I'm like, "I mean, kind of, I guess you could call me that." So help me understand when we're talking about presuppositionalism, what is it we're talking about?
Yeah. So I've been reading about, studying, writing on, doing presuppositional apologetics for almost 20 years now. And it has, as far as its public face, it has changed a lot. And there's a lot more out there than there used to be. I co-founded a website called Choosing Hats that's based on Cornelius Van Til's famous phrase that we can't just choose epistemologies the way that someone would choose a hat. That's probably a paraphrase, but anyway, there weren't many people writing on it back then. I mean, there were very few people writing on presuppositionalism back then. That puts me in like a maybe third generation presupper, I guess. I don't know. I was not on the Van Til list. I know those guys, but they're mostly Gen Xers.
Sure.
So anyway, since then, I mean, you had like Cy Tim Bruggencate, and I remember Cy asking about his website, Proof That God Exists, on MySpace. Right? So, I mean, this is, I'm waxing nostalgic here, but, you know, Cy drummed up a lot of followers, and so a lot of people came into presuppositionalism actually through him now, through kind of this street preaching. He's probably going to get upset if he watches this, but I'm going to say brawler kind of approach to presuppositionalism. And that is a very non-academic. I'm not putting this at size feet now, but that's a very non-academic approach.
Sure.
It's a very practical approach. I believe it's a very reductionist approach. And so a lot of that has led some of these guys out of, I believe, a staunch, deeper, reformed Christianity as a theology applied to unbelief. They're focusing more so on philosophical tactics and tools to kind of knock down those unbelieving objections. This is not a critique per se. If I run
Right.
across one of them on the street, I'm going to jump in with them, right? I'm not going to
Sure.
leave them
Sure.
sitting there knocking them down. But I think that some of that, and some of the folks who have recently picked up on it in web forums or whatever, it's like a whole world out there that I don't pay much attention to it. I think it's given presuppositionalism a bad name in that
Yeah.
regard. So you got all these guys just outright rejecting natural theology, not understanding its place in the Reformed tradition. Of course they haven't read the Scholastics. It's not even on their radars.
Right.
Um, on the other hand, you have had a pretty strong push even through the academy in terms of presuppositionalists. You know, when I began, there were not that many Van Tillians in the academy. There were not that many Van Tillians with PhDs. You could basically count them on one hand, and now that's not the case. We're everywhere. But um, bring me back to your question on that. I think that's how I would preface the answer to that question. But
That's great. No, that's helpful to kind of understand the landscape behind it, the different streams that are out there right now. Because yeah, I remember in 2020, that's what kind of happened to me. I used to see these street preachers in Boulder, and some of them are crazier than others. And by crazy, I mean some of them are pretty whack theologically. But I remember thinking like 10 years ago, I was like, those guys are full of crap. Like that's not the way we reach people. And then 2020 hits, and I'm like, that man's doing the Lord's work. Like at least he's out there, man. Like at least he's trying. And so that's really helpful with the background you shared. The question I wanted to know is like, if you had to help, if I've got someone at my church listening, or even for myself, if you had to describe presuppositional,
gotcha.
maybe how it's different than others, what is presuppositional apologetics?
Yeah, presuppositionalism, I believe, is not merely a heart posture or a heart attitude, like John Frame would say, right? So you were saying that Frame told you you're a presuppositionalist. Well, maybe you are. Frame likes to make everybody a presuppositionalist, right? He called Sproul an honorary presuppositionalist, even though R.C. Sproul famously rejected it in his debate with Greg Bahnsen. Presuppositionalism is at least, though, a heart attitude or whatever. So we sanctify Christ the Lord as holy, right? That's where our apologetic begins. And so our motive for doing apologetics is certainly explicitly Christian. If it's not, I'm not sure what you're doing, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's not like you're starting over every time from some sort of neutral posture toward neutral evidence if you're an
Right.
apologist. On the other hand, it's not merely that motivational aspect. I'm using Frame's triad here, or a ripoff of it, to kind of take
Great.
a shot at Frame.
Sure.
Our standard is presuppositional, which is to say that the absolute objective truth is the Christian worldview. I'm going to throw that term out there. I know that is a whole
Yeah.
other debate, but
Yep.
our standard is the Christian worldview. It is the scriptures. This is the revelation of God. All of it, by the way. It's not just God in some general theistic sense. It is Christianity as a whole. Now you can debate about what that means. Van Til, famously said that Reformed Christianity is the truest expression of what we find in the Scriptures. And so that's what he set out to defend. And there are reasons for that, because systematic theology is systematic. When you mess with one part of it, it changes something on another part of your theological scheme. So that's kind of the standard, right? The norm, the normative perspective. Now let's talk about
Yeah.
the situational perspective, okay? If you have a heart that is submitting to Christ as Lord, and if that standard is Christ is Lord, the actual standard, objectively, absolutely, whatever, then situationally, or in terms of application, you're not going to swap out your apologetic methodology. You're not going to swap out your entire theology, which is what that would entail, right? If
Mm,
you were to change apologetics at that point, you'd be changing your theology. And again, this just doesn't make sense unless you're just a all-out postmodernist, in which case, why are you doing Christian apologetics?
sure.
So uh, you're going to see presuppositionalism coming through in every aspect of the way that you make your arguments, objectively speaking, right? This is one of the problems that I have with like William Lane Craig and his distinction between knowing that Christianity is true and showing that Christianity is true, because it at the end of the day renders Christianity a type of subjective proof, like a Mormon would have, right? Oh, I have a burning in my bosom. I just know that this is true in
Sure.
my heart. Now, let me attempt to show this to you. But if you knock down every proof or argument that I show you, or every evidence that I show you, at least at the end of the day, I know I've got this burning in my bosom, right? So
Sure.
you're actually offering a different grounds for belief than what you're saying your belief is based on, which is this
Yeah.
purely subjective whisper from the Spirit or some
Right.
such. That's not a reformed view of the work of the Spirit, by the way. Um, anyway, so I think presuppositionalism is just something like that. It's not merely recognizing that we all have presuppositions, even though it is that. It's recognizing that everyone is either a covenant keeper or a covenant breaker, and we present a positive vision of Christianity, the Christian worldview, and then we show that it's sufficient to provide us with a metaphysic, with an epistemology, with an ethic, with an aesthetic, all of that. And if you reject that Christian worldview, then you are wedding yourself to what we would say is autonomy, which is the rejection of God's understanding of the world. And that would-be autonomous view cannot account for and cannot create a consistent metaphysic or epistemology or ethic or aesthetic.
Okay. Yeah, I really appreciate the Framian reference there. I didn't hear a critique though. You said you were critiquing Frame, and
Well,
I'm like,
it's more than a merely Frame seems to reduce it at times to merely the motivational or existential, I think he calls it,
yep, yep.
perspective.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a point of conversation within that, whether it's with Poitras or other people. Uh, is there a primary in the triad? And it's not something that I've bothered myself to look into or to argue a case for. I don't think I think I noticed that in my work, but I don't think I like try to like pinpoint like it starts here. I think most Christians, and I'm fine with this, are comfortable with the norming norm of Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Let's at least have that at the top of the triad. Uh, but yeah, it's an interesting point of conversation in there. I'm curious though. I haven't heard about this disagreement between Sproul and Frame on this matter. Can you help me understand what Sproul was pushing back on or reject? Or no, it was Sproul and Bonson you referenced.
Oh, yeah.
What was Sproul disagreeing with Bonson about?
Oh, so there's a there's a famous debate between Greg Bonson and R.C. Sproul. Now, keep in mind what was going on at that time. They were fighting against the liberals, like full on, with regard to the doctrine of inerrancy, right? So they were friends in that regard. I mean, it's strange to think about this now, but Norm Geisler's book on inerrancy, he has an article in there from Greg Bonson. And they're not really friends in almost any way, theologically speaking, and yet Bonson was writing on things that helped the case for inerrancy. So all of them kind of linked arms for that. However, R.C. Sproul is a Thomist. R.C. Sproul relies heavily upon natural theology, and Bonson did not. And so there's a famous debate between Greg Bonson, R.C. Sproul. It got very heated. I've spoken to people who were there, and they said it fairly well continued out into the hallway afterward. But yeah, no, I would encourage your listeners and you to go find that. I'm sure it's free now
Yeah, I'll
because
try
of
to find it and put it in the show
Bonson
notes
U
for
and
the
all of that.
listeners. Yeah.
Yeah, which is another thing that's changed, by the way, since I started doing this. These things used to be very obscure sources. Like you
Yeah.
had to look and find them on cassette tape and everything else. Now they're just all out there. The work that Jeff Durbin and Apologia Radio is doing, and the Bonson University. There's another. I know there was Covenant Media Foundation that's kind of turned that over, but I feel like there was another company or whatever that had made that available. But anyway. Yeah, no, they had a debate full on between presuppositional apologetics and classical apologetics.
Okay, cool. That gets us to the next topic because everything you're saying right now, I'm tracking with. Yeah, I'm with you, Chris. I'm with you, Chris. So tell me, because I'm sure once my friends that are Sproul, Thomas, natural theology guys hear this, they're gonna be like, "Meh." And I want to get ahead of that, and I want to hear what would they say to push back on the presuppositional approach.
Well, I hate to make their case for them in that regard, but I've heard it all, right? Sproul had an objection. Remember, he wrote a book with Gerstner on classical apologetics, and they critique critique presuppositional apologetics in that book. And he had a problem with where we start from. This idea that epistemologically, and we're talking about logical priority here, right? We're not talking about chronology or anything like that. In terms of logical priority in our epistemological scheme, the ultimate authority, he says, is he doesn't come out and say it this way, but this is how presuppositionalists would frame the discussion. He wants to say we don't start with God. Like we
Okay,
start with ourselves. Everybody has to start. You have to start with yourself, or it's not you thinking, that sort of
sure.
thing.
Okay,
But nobody in the presuppositional camp, if they know what they're talking about, denies that there's a proximal starting point. There's a secondary starting point, which is the self, absolutely. But it's
sure.
always in submission to the Christ. The Lord is the ultimate epistemological starting point, logically speaking, in terms of logical priority. And there's not really a way to get around that. But um, I mean, that's one of the critiques. So they want to say, oh, well, you're being circular, right? You're committing this logical howler, as William Lane Craig says. So years ago, there was the book edited by, is it Stephen Cowan, the Five Views of Apologetics book, and John Frame is defending the presuppositionalist view in that book. William Lane Craig is defending the classical view in that book, and William Lane Craig accuses presuppositionalists of committing a logical howler, which is begging the question, or petitio principii, or circular reasoning, a circular argument. But then on the flip side, he says that Alvin Plantinga, who's a Reformed epistemologist, has given us a better use of the transcendental argument. The problem there is that presuppositionalism is not an argument per se. And so presuppositionalism, and Craig should know this as a philosopher, presuppositionalism as a methodology can't be construed in terms of a syllogism such that you can accuse it of committing a logical howler, namely the petitio principii, or circular reasoning, right? And again, he's praising the use of the transcendental argument, so why can't presuppositionalists just use the transcendental argument?
Sure.
TAs are recognized throughout the secular literature, and they're not circular arguments except in this sense. And there are plenty of philosophers who have talked about this. William Austin has talked about this. A.C. Grayling has talked about this. Those are more secular styled thinkers. I know Austin's not, but there is such a thing as epistemic circularity, and there's no way that I'm aware of to escape this.
You can't get away
Okay,
from it.
you can't get away from it, because, as Sproul would say, it's always you. Like, you're always the one thinking. You're the one thinking. It's not God thinking for you. Now you're to think God's thoughts after him.
Right.
But epistemic circularity is not objectionable on logical grounds,
Right.
which brings me to another point, which is that a lot of people complain that the transcendental argument that presuppositionalists supposedly rely on has never been properly formulated. So that we don't have an argument, they say. We don't know what the argument is. Well, then how is it circular? If you can't formulate an argument, then it's certainly not going to be a circular argument, right? That having been said, I think, and I'd have to go back and review, that Frame actually does spell out in a type of syllogistic form a use of what he would call a transcendental argument in that Five Views book that is, I think you could call it, like, directly circular in a logical sense. And I do think that's a problem. I don't think that we do right in a rational or an ethical sense if we just blatantly beg the question in a narrow, viciously circular manner, and then say, "Who cares? You can't get on me about that." No, I mean, that's just as bad as the postmodernists and the
Sure.
things they
Yeah.
do, or some such. So,
Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah.
So
I chase a
with
lot of rabbits, so you need to keep bringing me back.
I'm trying. I'm trying. My listeners are going to be like overloaded at this point. My computer's overheating, and I have a feeling the audience is overheated on what all you're referencing. So let's chase this rabbit then. One of the things I encounter with hardcore precepts is kind of a refusal to practice either ressourcement or to listen to like Aristotle, Plato, anybody like that. I don't understand that. Can you help me understand why they're behaving that way? And when I like quote Aristotle, they're like, "You can't, do that." And I'm like, "What did I do? I violated some creed of presuppositionalism. Why are they so aggravated about that?"
Yeah, I think that there is a type of more fundamentalist type. I just said type twice, but anyway, presuppositionalism, where philosophy itself as a discipline is a bad thing to be avoided.
Oh, okay.
And so again, it comes back to these are street brawlers, and which is fine.
Yeah.
They're just not going to be interested in ressourcement. They're not going to be interested in Reformed scholasticism. Now, I think at the end of the day, I'm going to have some fundamental disagreements with Reformed scholastics. However, that's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We shouldn't do that.
Right.
We need a respect for those guys. And it's fascinating to me when we look at the history of the development of natural theology, um, how that can play into even a presuppositional type view of things. I think of presuppositionalism as a holistic way of thinking about theology and apologetics and philosophy before the apologetics. It's holistic. So you're going to, if you are true to the truest expression of Christianity, which is the Reformed faith, you're going to offer some of these things as part and parcel of the Christian worldview. So, for example, I have no objection against natural theology as such, depending upon what is meant by that.
Sure.
Even when we get into this idea of syllogistic arguments and reasoning, the so-called classical proofs, uh, I have no problem with them insofar as each premises rather of the argument and the conclusion at each step is already recognizing and presupposing the Christian worldview.
Right. Yeah.
Uh,
Right.
because once you step off that, I mean, there are multiple arguments against it at that point. You have theological objections to that improper use of natural theology, and you have philosophical objections against it. So,
Yeah, so let's chase that then. Natural theology. Um, One thing that came up is, I talked with Frame, and he's got these what he calls militant Thomists coming after him. Okay, and I think it's over his doctrine of God. And I do not. We're not going to chase this one. There's a whole different episode I need to do on the doctrine of God and the whole debate going on over the last decade in that space. But I think that is a tangential topic, but mainly he's talking about militant Thomism. And so when I started my research, I'm reading Puritans and I'm seeing them talk about Aquinas, or I'm seeing them use syllogisms. I'm seeing them do all the things that like the precepts have been like, don't do that, or like avoid that. And so now all of a sudden I'm like, well, it's inevitable. Like if you're going to study history and church history and Christian
mhm.
history, these guys were doing that. So unless you're really, like you said, unless you're ready to throw the baby out with the bathwater and just cut ourselves off from tradition, which I am not interested in doing, then that's where you're going to end up. So help me understand, when we're talking about natural theology, what are we referencing there?
Yeah, I believe in natural theology in the sense of the immediate revelation of God through His creation. And so, just in virtue of having been created in the image of God, even, we know God exists. There is a natural, religious knowledge of God. It was clearly there in the garden, and when Adam disobeyed God, right, and Adam is our federal head, uh, made it such that some of this fellowship has been broken, so that the ungodly, the unbeliever, knows the truth, sees the truth, right, knows that there's a God because God has made it plain to him in the things that have been made, and yet he suppresses the truth in unrighteousness, right? So we're affected by total depravity. There are the noetic effects of sin. Sin actually affects our ability to know as we should know. Nevertheless, the image is there, right? And so when and this is Calvin, and Frame draws this out into his triad, which I appreciate. In virtue of who God is, we know God exists. In virtue of the more you study yourself, the more you have that knowledge of God. The more you study, not because you are God, but because
Sure.
God is God, you're His creature.
Right.
When you study the world about you, that's also the revelation of God. I have a question. I'm going to give away the answer, I guess, to any of my future students. But I have a question on one of my quizzes, um, and it asks about. It says something like true or false. Um, Human beings are the revelation of God. It sounds like prosperity
Yeah.
gospel or something. Like, oh, there's a little glint of the divine in you or something. It's like,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
okay, but actually, yeah, we are created in the image of God, and
Right.
so rightly understood, we're the creature of God, and we're the revelation of God. We're created to bring God glory, just like the rest of the external world around us. So, um, oh, I lost my train of thought there. Where were we on
We're
that?
talking about natural theology, how we
Yeah.
can know,
So
and
so
what we're
that's
doing
one
with natural
sense.
theology.
That's one sense of natural theology. It's just the immediate revelation of God. Okay, we know God. We have a natural knowledge of God. Okay, there's also an indirect or mediate knowledge of God, an acquired knowledge of God, in the sense that we can reason and argue and come to these understandings of various attributes of God, or the existence of God and that sort of thing. Um, those should always, in a proper use of natural theology, be tethered to our natural knowledge of God. Those should always be tethered to the Christian worldview, um, so that, um, again, like I said earlier, each premises of the argument and premise of the argument and each conclusion is going to already presuppose or assume those things that we already should know about God. Um, and there are various uses for that inferential. Do your listeners know what I mean by inferential? So you're going through a reasoning process here,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
So everything that begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, right? That's the Kalam cosmological argument.
Yep.
You're drawing an inference, right, from those two premises to that conclusion to say that the universe is caused. I mean, I believe that as a Christian. Do I believe all three? I believe I believe that everything that begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being. I believe that the universe began to exist, and I believe that the universe is caused. I don't have any objection to that stated as a Christian proof, and I think that's why Christians find these things persuasive. Actually,
Sure.
is
Yeah.
because they already believe them.
Yeah.
Uh, but from a non-Christian standpoint, you can tear that argument all to shreds. And you can use that argument from a different so-called theistic position to
Right.
prove the wrong God, to prove the
Yeah.
wrong cause
Right.
of the universe. So again, you can levy theological and philosophical objections against the improper use of natural theology in that sense. Now, let me mention this real quick. I was on this a minute ago. These inferential arguments, you can take them and use them to fill out and give you a more whole picture of the Christian worldview in terms of reasoning. Right? Those are steps of reasoning that you can go through, faith-seeking understanding, and understand that truth about God. Okay, for the Christian, as it were, for a part of systematic theology. Or you can take that and then use it in an apologetic encounter. Now, the presuppositionalist would use that in one of two ways, or both. One, the unbeliever sees that overall the Christian worldview is consistent with itself, is coherent, is persuasive in that sense, that even reasoning itself is not at odds with the things we already believe. Here are these natural theological arguments. They're tinker toys, but they work with our view.
Sure.
Okay? Or you can take it and kind of throw it into the unbelieving worldview and say, now, what do you do with that? Right? You
Right.
get an agnostic. Oh, I don't know whether or not there's a God. Okay, what is God? Well, the greatest conceivable being. Okay. Well, it's not the greatest conceivable being if it doesn't exist, right? Oh. Oh. Well, now what do you have to do?
Yeah.
If someone is willing to admit the possibility that God exists, whatever that is, then they're going to have to also concede that God, whatever that is, actually does exist. So that in and of itself is a problem, logically speaking, for the agnostic. Now, all that is a negative transcendental critique that does not bring that person into the faith, as it were. But I call them, it's like throwing a wrench into their engine, right?
Yeah.
You
Sure.
pitch it in there and it muddies the waters. Um, so yeah, anyway, there's something else I was going to say on that, but there you go.
I think I can sense one thing that might frustrate those who are maybe more like Sproul, maybe more like natural theology guys, is that precepts tend to just go, hey, that's a nice toy you got there. Why don't I put it to good use? And like they kind of are like they're willing to take your syllogism. I'll take your syllogism and I'm going to turn it into an apologetic tool to go out. I wonder if there's some frustration there, and it's like, no, 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 no. That's not what I'm doing here. Is that have you encountered that before? Is that maybe what's going on?
Well, usually what I'm giving to you is seen as kind of a bridge to make peace with the Thomists. Okay. Um, but because the guys who are doing presup in a more fundamentalist way and just saying, well, here's the word of God, you believe it or you don't, and can you be certain of that, that those kind of arguments, these general skeptical or global skeptical arguments that they use as a negative transcendental critique, and that's as far as they go. Usually those guys are just like, no natural theology at all,
Sure,
right?
sure.
So I'm not doing that, right? Because
Okay.
for one thing, that's not Reformed. That does not match up with the history of Reformed thought. And there is a development of these themes, by the way. It's anyway. So when somebody says, no, look at the Reformed scholastics, they're not outright rejecting these things like Karl Barth did.
Mhm.
I agree, they're not.
Yeah,
I also would say Karl Barth is not a Van Tillian. Stop trying to make that argument. They're completely different.
yeah.
But this is a good place to press this difference, though. I mentioned earlier the situational use of presuppositional apologetics. That if we have the motive there, the existential perspective, right? If we have the standard there, the normative perspective, then the situational perspective should be there, right? The application then should actually evidence in an overt way our presuppositionalism. And so here's where Frame and Sproul would have to disagree, right? Sproul would have to say, and this is kind of unfair because I'm like fictionalizing these accounts, but anyway, Sproul would have to say, no, I'm presenting these natural theological proofs as this sort of neutral, reasoning game. And we're going to start with things they agree with and then reason through these premises to bring them, from this neutral stance into believing in God. And that's just against the word of God. That's against total depravity. Um, and whereas Frame would not say that per se, but again, I think there are times where he leaves that out when he Frame's still alive. So, and I've never actually talked to him, so maybe he can get upset by this and shoot me an email. And but anyway, yeah, I think he leaves that out sometimes. The importance of the fact that the presuppositionalism should come through in the way that we construe our actual objective argumentation.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, it would be interesting. I've had Frame on the show before, but it would be interesting to see how Frame here's your representation of the view. Kind of going back to, let's go back to the beginning, and that's how we'll close out as well. PhD, David Hume, skepticism. Um, I feel like there's a bridge here because obviously, if you're one of those, I'm not using this pejoratively, fundamentalist presuppositionalists who are welcome and I love them and like, let's work together. They would see kind of engaging Hume as like, why waste your time? Like, let's not do that. How did you engage Hume and why is skepticism? Why did you turn skepticism against skepticism in your research?
Yeah, Hume is easy to read. Um, Plantinga says something like there's a surface level clarity, but then when you dig into it, he's saying some pretty profound things, and he is. Hume essentially starts as an empiricist, meaning that all of our knowledge is based on those things that we perceive through the five senses, and then we have a perception of them or whatever in the mind. Well, this makes it so that the world is divvied up into these little, we'll call them atoms, right? Like everything is completely disconnected from everything else. And so Hume runs up against the problem of personal identity, where he says, who is Chase Davis? Like, is Chase Davis the same guy he was yesterday? I mean, you've eaten things since then, so you've changed physically. You've drank things since then, so you've changed physically. You think a little bit differently than you did yesterday, so you're changing in terms of your thinking. Like, what is it that makes Chase, right? And Hume would say, well, we're bundles of experience. And as Greg Bonson points out in the debate that never was, where he goes through and just absolutely rips Michael Martin's material to shreds, Bonson points out that Hume can't even say that there are bundles, right? Like, what's a bundle? A bundle is a
Yeah, sure.
unifying feature of the universe. He doesn't have that appeal to unity, a unifying principle in the universe there. So he can't even speak of bundles of experience. But more famously, Hume said, "Look, we have these experiences. of what would seem to be cause and effect. Well, for one thing, we don't actually see cause and effect. You can't perceive that with the eye. You see the one billiard ball strike the other billiard ball, and you see the motion of the first, you see the motion of the second, but you don't see anything in between. You don't actually see cause and effect. It's like an inference that you draw. But why are you drawing that inference? All you ever have is A and then B, A and then B, A and then B. So, what is that necessary connection between the two that would make it rational to draw an inference from it? How do we draw general and singular predictive inferences from our immediate experience? How do we know that future experience will resemble past experience? How do you know that this scientific experiment, I'm not really quoting Hume at this point, but how do you know that this one scientific experiment that you do over here is going to hold true in a different part of the world? That sort of thing. And what he's looking for there is a uniformity of nature. And Hume says it won't do to say, well, in the past, future experience has resembled past experience, because then you are begging the question. You're making a viciously circular argument. You're
Sure.
saying just because in the past the future has resembled the past, therefore in the future it will. He says, no, that's the very thing you need to prove. How do you know that tomorrow, when you get out of bed, gravity's going to hold you to the floor instead of flinging you off into the sky, right? There's no way to rationally infer that. And Hume's coming up with this skeptical worry. He's actually, I believe he probably had read Al-Ghazali. I have some more studying to do on that. But he references other philosophers having thought of this before him, but this is never picked up on the literature that I'm aware of. But Al-Ghazali makes these same arguments, and he was a much earlier Muslim philosopher. But Hume comes up with this right as science is taking off. Well, once you undermine, this is called inductive reasoning, right? Drawing these singular and general predictive inferences from immediate experience. Once you undermine inductive reasoning, you've undermined science itself. There are
Mm.
lots of different ways that people have tried to come up with to answer Hume's worry, but what I do in my dissertation, in my book, is I take those apart. I say this doesn't work, and in fact, the only way that we can, and I think I'm more modest than this in my book just for academic purposes, but the only way that we have any type of solution to this supposed problem is in terms of the Christian worldview, right? So Genesis 8:22, God promises us regularities in terms of the seasons and the world itself. The seasons, the harvest time, all of that will continue as they have in general, right? You have this reasonable expectation that things will generally continue as they have in the past. In fact, this is why we put so much stock in miracles in Christianity, because they're signs or omens that where nature appears to go out of her way. Why? Because it's not nature going out of her way. God providentially controls everything, right? Every event that takes place has two agents, as it were. There's God, and then there's that thing. But God is the one who is providentially in control of all things in terms of his eternal decree. So that is how we as Christians can understand this, that the Christ himself, even as the eternal Son, is upholding all things. He's holding all things together, Colossians 1:17. And so as a Christian, we have a basis for the so-called principle of uniformity of nature, or regularities, order, predictability, all these sorts of things. And when you take that into an unbelieving view of the world, you don't have any of those. And I don't care if it's another religion. That's what I go into in my book with Islam.
Yeah, with
You
Islam.
don't have that. So going back to the natural theological argument, the Kalam argument, whatever begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being. Why do you believe that? If you reject Christianity, you have no reason to accept that premise.
Yeah,
If you go look at William Lane Craig's work on it, his doctoral work on it, he doesn't actually prove that premise of the argument at all. He just basically dismisses you if you call it into question. There's no actual reasonable argument for holding that premise to be true. Now, I believe it's true, but I'm a
sure.
Christian.
Yeah,
So again, that argument serves to fill out my worldview, but
yeah,
it doesn't do anything for an unbeliever who's consistent.
yeah. Right. That's great. Well, this was really helpful, Chris. I want to point people towards your book. Where can people pick that up? Is it on Amazon?
It's on Amazon. It's at Barnes and Noble. It's at Target, I think. I was gonna get it from Target. Uh, but yeah, it's available. It's available at Christian book distributors.
There you go.
That is. I know I have made it right when it's there. It's not advertised there because nobody cares, but it is on CBD, or
And
what used to be called CBD.
what's the title of the book for my listeners?
It's called "The World in His Hands: A Christian Account of Scientific Law and Its Antithetical Competitors."
Excellent. All right, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And then if people want to keep up with you, what's the best way to keep up with you? Obviously, Twitter is spotty,
Twitter
given
for
your
now.
proclivities.
Twitter for now. I had a podcast for a little while with my friend Brian Knapp called Revelationary Apologetics. You can look that up here on YouTube. These topics that we've addressed, I've actually addressed in more depth on other podcasts. Eli Ayala's Revealed Apologetics. There's Rooted in Revelation. So if you go look up my name, some of those will come up. I'd also point you to the panel discussion I did with Lane Tipton and Sam Waldron earlier this year. We go in depth on some of the more theologically rigorous aspects of this. And if you talk about classical theism and the Trinity, by the way, you need to have Lane Tipton on. But he's probably not going to hold back. I'm just going to forewarn you.
That's great. That's fine. I don't mind that at all. All right. Well, Chris, this was a great conversation. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Chase.
Absolutely. Hey, if you're a listener and you enjoyed this episode, give it a great rating, subscribe. I think some people say smash that subscribe button. Go on and do that. I'm almost up to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, so I'd love your support there. That's kind of a good benchmark for people. You can also sign up on the Patreon. We've got merch there, or I'll send you a sticker or a mug depending on what you sign up for there. So go sign up on the Patreon, and we'll see you next time.